The Owl House has already proven itself to be a long-standing classic, and not only one of Disney Channel's greatest animated programs, but also one of the top cartoons from its era. There are many factors that make it so endearing, including its groundbreaking portrayal of LGBT plus relationships and identities, not shying away from harsh topics that even adult animation dare not talk about, including destructive religion, parental abuse, corruption, and genocide, its lively world of unique characters that make Bonesboro and Gravesfield, Connecticut all the more fleshed out, etc., etc. However, perhaps there is something that hasn't yet been discussed. Of course, that's not to say the previous pieces were of any less value, but they've already been thoroughly dissected. Rather, what shall be deconstructed is in the world of the Boiling Isles itself, being in how its inhabitants live, their history, and their current-day culture. In all honesty, this magical realm borrows many factors of various pagan religions. Since paganism can refer to any native religion displaced by Christianity, these elements can be broken down by which groups hold these beliefs. And perhaps one of the most familiar groups of paganism, especially to the modern audience, is Norse paganism. So, how pagan is the Owl House? To begin, it is important to note how the Owl House's production was influenced. According to an article from One of Us about the Annecy Animation Festival in 2019, Bonesboro, and the Boiling Isles as a whole, took inspiration from the works of many European artists, with Remedios Varo, John Bauer, and Hieronymus Bosch being given special mention. The strongest of these three painters in its influence was Hieronymus Bosch, and when examining his artwork, it becomes very clear as to why. While the Dutch painter was most famous for his works relating to Christianity, there were plenty of surreal elements. Take, for example, Laatste Oordeel Drieluik, Last Judgment, where there are fish-like humanoids, as well as birds, goblins, and demons who also act with various human characteristics. However, some of these aren't nearly as massive though, even if his triptychs are the most popular. Swedish painter Jan Bauer was born in Jönköping in 1882, and most of his work composed of illustrations of folklore, especially for early editions of the anthology series of children's books Bland Tomtar och Troll, Among Gnomes and Trolls. The most famous of his works is the 1913 piece, Still, Tovstar sits and gazes down into the water, one of many paintings in which he would use watercolors. Perhaps the most familiar form of mythology to many in the culture of the Owl House's viewership is Nordic and Germanic mythology. In reference to what these mean, Nordic refers to the cultures of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Greenland, while Germanic includes the aforementioned Nordic cultures, as well as Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, England, and northern France. The Germanic people who occupy these groups can be broken down into mini tribes, with some of them lasting until the early 1100s. It should be noted that Germanic groups spread their culture over centuries on perhaps one of the widest scales, only being rivaled by the influences of Rome and Islam. In fact, English, the language it is being written in, is of Germanic descent, being spread over to 1 billion speakers in the real world, as well as the residents of the Boiling Isles. Canonically, Philip and Caleb Whittabane lived in Gravesfield, Connecticut during the mid-1600s. It is likely that they were direct descendants of English settlers who left the country because they couldn't practice their version of Christianity as it did not align with the Church of England, and then went to Leiden in the Netherlands. Afterwards, they left for two reasons. The first was that they faced economic hardship there, but the second was that they feared that their children were becoming Dutch. The funny thing is that both England and the Netherlands, again, are of the same Germanic origin. You see, the Anglo-Saxons were believed to have formed with some Scandinavians from the shores of southern Norway and southwest Sweden sometime in the 6th century, as well as from the realm of Syagrius circa 450. Meanwhile, the Netherlands consisted of many tribes, such as the Frisians, Batavians, and Saxons, to name a few. Germanic Britain was kind of like a melting pot of many cultures. The Roman Empire invaded Britain in 43 CE, but while they were successful in conquering England, there were many tribes historically that wouldn't easily relinquish control. Meanwhile, after the fall of Rome, Danish Vikings would raid the British Isles in the next few centuries. In fact, Scandinavia would greatly influence England through its language and the economy. All this ended in 1066, though, when Normandy conquered the kingdom. Thus, it becomes clear that this early New England town is a product of many cultural fusions that took thousands of years. Meanwhile, the event that led to Philip Wittebane taking power in the Boiling Isles started with his older brother Caleb being lured away by some strange witch. Because they lived in a Puritan society, they became witch hunters, so logically, he sought to hunt down his supposed captor. However, when it became clear that his brother had actually gone voluntarily because he had fallen in love, Philip murdered Caleb, betraying the relationship that they had as orphans in a new land, where he planned a final solution to kill all witches and to strip the demon realm of its magic. To stay alive for around 400 years, he had to consume the souls of palismen, which are little creatures that are crafted from wood by witches and come to life. And all this was to serve his god, of which his worshippers taught him to hate these otherworldly beings. This can be examined in two ways in relation to pagan history. The first is from a historical perspective, where one can find many examples of genocide, both in culture and in life, all in the name of religion. In particular note to this section, though, is the Christianization of Europe, especially Scandinavia. During Rome's rule in the 300s, Constantine would make Christianity the official religion of Rome, and from there its influence spread rapidly. However, Germanic areas wouldn't give up so easily. It wasn't until the 800s that Christianity had taken over Germany, and while Denmark was willing to become Christian thanks to their connections with the outside world, Norway and Sweden fought with all their might before being Christianized in the second millennium Anno Domini. When Christianization came into the picture, it wasn't just the religion that was replaced, it was the entire culture. Since worship was often personal and ceremonies were held outside, there were hardly any architectural remnants, and since these old religions were framed as enemies that needed to be erased, most remnants of Viking culture were destroyed. In fact, it's only in Sweden and Iceland that most remnants of the Norse people have been found. Knowing this, the connection becomes clear as day between Philip's contact with the demon realm and Christianity's contact with Scandinavia. Not only did they worship the same god, but they were also willing to get militant with it. They were both willing to destroy whole cultures in their name, and while one would only destroy it if their target was less willing to convert, the other had his Holocaust as the end-all be-all all along. Another parallel is in the worlds themselves. There's actually a post on the Owl House's subreddit by NarrowLuck3622 that is about the Owl House's Nordic roots. Starting with the story of the first man to enter the world of the witches, Philip's journey is akin to Odin, one of the most famous gods. Both Belos, the name Philip took, and Odin were known to be ruthless in their goals, as well as being able to make anyone do their bidding through their cunning manipulation skills. Both of them also hold a false image of being revered leaders, though while Belos carefully crafted this image of being the savior of the Boiling Isles in order for everyone to unify under him, Odin's portrayal of honor and nobility is more so born out of a shallow understanding of Norse mythology. In addition, Belos united the witches under the Coven system, where there are 9 tracks that the witches are split into based on the type of magic that they will practice for the rest of their life. Meanwhile, during the Aesir-Vanir War, Odin would unite the gods into a single group as well. But I repeat that there were a total of 9 covens in Belos' system. Why? Because Aesir in Asgard led 9 realms. Next comes their appearance. When you look at these two, you will notice some very similar design choices. Horned helmets? Check. Damaged eye? Check. Odin lost one eye in a quest to become all-seeing. Spear-like object? Check. Cape? Check, check, and double check. The last thing that Narrow Luck mentioned is that in a more abstract way, Odin's 2 crows are represented by Lilith and Kikimora. This is because of the work they do. Odin would send his 2 crows for reconnaissance in the morning, and they would return at noon with the information that he wanted. Meanwhile, Kikimora was a more general version of this, while Lilith had her sights specifically set on Ida as her target, thinking she should bring her to Belos, which would rid her of the curse that she brought. Another god worth mentioning is Loki, who can actually be divided into 2 characters. The first is Rain. While they certainly aren't evil, as the original post notes, they are similar in status. If Coven witches represent Aesir and Wild witches represent Vanir, then they follow in a similar footstep to Loki, who is neither Aesir nor Vanir. There's also the fact that Rain objected to Belos in the same way Loki did to Odin, as he called him out for how he deceived with hypocrisy, lies, and manipulation. Meanwhile, the other character that Loki is represented by through his more chaotic tendencies is the Collector. Why? Because, again, both of them are abundantly chaotic, but they're also experts in magic. Also, when the Collector was freed from Belos' orb, they would turn the Boiling Isles into a hellish nightmare, much like how the release of Loki is bound to bring Ragnarok. The last character of note is Ida, and while one would assume that she's representative of Loki due to her trickster natures, this isn't so. Instead, she is more of a hybrid of multiple gods. The first of these is Mimir, who was traded as a hostage in the Aesir-Vanir War. However, while he was of high value, he managed to be traded with Hoenir, who was rather irrelevant, and because in their eyes Mimir deceived them, he was decapitated and then sent back to Odin, who gave his head new life. Do you want to know who else can survive as just a decapitated head? None other than Ida. Meanwhile, she also encompasses Idun, a goddess representing youth that is believed to trace back to the poetic Edda. Yes, the names themselves are similar. This is through the owl motif, as in general, owls are an important creature in Norse mythology. They symbolize a great wisdom. Owls are also known for their kindness and helpfulness, and that definitely applies to Ida. Yes, despite being an outlaw and a rebellious girl who might have been a bit self-interested, though not out of narcissism, she grew into being more willing to open herself up to relationships with others, even adopting King as a Clawthorn. In addition, she is also quite the fan of apple blood, somewhat similarly to how Idun would use apples to retain her youth. All of these make a case for connecting the living inhabitants of the Boiling Isles to some of the tales of Asatru. Meanwhile, the Boiling Isles itself formed from the remains of the Titan, the god who died in the middle of the boiling seas. The first thing to come to mind of this is Ymir, who was not just an intersex giant, but was the very first giant, and an ancestor to not just every giant, but to almost all gods thereafter. More specifically, Ymir asexually reproduced several giants, and sweat them out through his armpits and legs, and one of them freed Buri, the first Aesir god. Eventually from this, Odin and his brothers would be created, and they formed Midgard, which is the earth we live on. How did they do this? Obviously, they killed Ymir, and as Grimny Small recounts, from Ymir's flesh the earth was created, and from his sweat/blood the sea. the mountains from bone, trees from hair, and from his skull the sky. And from his eyebrows the blithe gods made Midgard, home of the sons of men, and from his brains they sculpted the grim clouds. As to what the Titan's body has given to its inhabitants, his blood would be mined by the demons that lived on him, and the whole reason the witches could use magic in the first place was because it was so potent. It essentially radiated off the Titan onto other life forms, and they would evolve to adapt it into their biology. But they had to have come from somewhere, and it is believed that some sludge from the decomposing Titan was where life developed. Meanwhile, several different parts of the Titan's body host several different climates, with the Looking Glass ruins in the forest on his forearm, while Blight Industries is headquartered on his right arm, a snow-covered mountain on his knee, and the castle at his skull. Meanwhile, another interpretation is that the Boiling Isles is the world after Ragnarok. Worth noting is that the Titans were killed not just by the Titan Trappers, but also the Collectors. The battle may have been fierce, but the Collectors used their unique form of magic, and while trying to save his son King from the Collectors, the Titan spirit was dragged from his body. It is stated that during Ragnarok, amidst all the fighting, the world will end when, quote, the giant Surtur will cast his flaming sword onto the ground and set the 9 realms ablaze. This includes Jotunheim, which was known to be snowy and icy. The most shocking thing of all, Ragnarok is not a prophecy of what's to come, but has already happened, and it is told by the gods that have survived, and Midgard is left to be populated by 2 humans, Leif and Leifthrassir. Even though canonically the Titans didn't die via burning, it's not hard to imagine that perhaps collector magic could have incinerated the flesh of the Titan. After all, by the time we do see it, it is nothing more than a skeleton with a few of the core organs and muscles remaining. And if there is one other thing that radiated from the Titan worth talking about, it's the magic. From the Titan's body spread a magic that is wielded by the witches through a special writing system being the glyphs. These glyphs will cause various things to happen, such as light, fire, and ice. They can also be combined to do more complex acts, like invisibility. Sound familiar? This system is quite common in fantasy works, but it doesn't come from nowhere. You see, they can all be traced back to the various runes used by the Germanic people. In ancient Norse culture, runes were the main alphabet used in writing. However, they were letters second, and were vessels for magical powers first and foremost. These could range from cursing with or protecting against misfortune, telling the future, or especially bringing good health. These would often be carved into various stones, and a good example is the Glandrup stone, which curses anybody who moves or damages it. Meanwhile, various glyphs exist for various purposes thanks to the 9 covens, such as healing, abominations, potions, and plants. An example of these being used for healing is in Egil's saga, where Egil heals the gravely ill daughter of a farmer. He does this by finding a whalebone that is presumed to have been from an illiterate farmer boy, but is actually a curse. Afterwards, he carves different runes that reverse the negative effects in favor of healing. Runes, much like glyphs, should also never make their way into the wrong hands. The previous story already demonstrates this, and after healing the girl, Egil warns this. Runes none should grave ever, who knows not to read them. Of dark spell full many the meaning may miss. 10 spell words writ wrongly on whalebone were graven, whence to leak tending maiden long sorrow and pain. So what about the glyphs in the Owl House? The misuse of these has been seen a number of times in the series. The obvious example would be in Luz, who was new to the world and had to go through the learning system in a short amount of time. While it can just be as silly as her little mistakes in her audition for Hexside during the first day, they can cause serious physical injury or death to oneself or others. Take the invisibility combo, for example. In it are 2 light and 2 ice glyphs. However, what if someone accidentally substitutes the light glyphs with plant glyphs and adds one ice glyph too many? Then you get petrification, which, need I remind you, can turn the victim into stone and make them wither away when touched. And if it can be done accidentally, then there is plenty of room for glyphs to be used maliciously, and from there they become much more of a force to be reckoned with. Another thing with these runes and glyphs worth mentioning is the aesthetic and connotations they carry. From here, there needs to be a warning. What you are about to see relates to real-world bigotry and fascism that is more active in the modern day. Why should I mention this? You see, in the real world, runes have taken on a new life, and a sinister one at that. Germany, during their period in the 1930s, adopted fascist rule, and one of the core tenets of fascism is a binding sense of national identity. To do this, they adopted various historic symbols, and while some of them are more apparent, others are more subtle, especially the runes. Take, for example, Othala, a rune from the Elder Futhark alphabet that disappeared but came back in Anglo-Saxon Futhark. The rune is the equivalent to the letter O and is known to mean wealth or heritage. In this era, it would be used for 2 army divisions, though it was modified to include 2 other lines, either representing its feet or wings. Ever since, it has been adopted by several other far-right groups, such as the NS movement as of 2016. A reminder that this is the Othala rune. Sound familiar? Why yes, that name is quite similar to Odalia Blight. And what is Odalia's role in the series? To slowly make Amity conform to fit the public image of Blight Industries and keep her in a position that she will inherit an ultra-powerful corporation. In other words, Odalia is trying to enforce her status of wealth and heritage unto Amity and her siblings. Not only that, but fittingly enough, Odalia is one of the most infamous villains from the series, being an abusive sociopath. She did not care about the well-being of anyone around her, as she was more than willing to torment her own children for not complying to her whims, and was thoroughly willing to participate in a genocide of her own race as long as she and her family would live and become powerful. This is very similar to several corporations who are willing to do business with totalitarian states, not caring about the atrocities they're funding. All in the name of Othala. Another symbol is the Valknut, which are 3 interlocked triangles, and with a bit of mystery behind it. For one, the name wasn't settled on until the 20th century. Meanwhile, its purpose currently remains unknown to modern-day archaeologists. It could be related to the Snåldeli stone from the 9th century. However, the most popular usage is in connection to Odin and the afterlife. And because of this connection to pagan culture, it has become another symbol that some people would bear as a dog whistle. Now take a look at the outfit of the Emperor's Coven members. You may notice that a recurring symbol among the Coven is triangles. It may seem like a coincidence, but when considering Belos' similarities to Odin, and considering the role of the Emperor's Coven to do the will of Belos, it seems to make a lot more sense as to why the triangle would be used. To make it clear, I have no support for these movements at all. Fascist movements, no matter how they present themselves, must be derided. They must be scorned by the public. In fact, part of the reason I'm mentioning these are for another purpose. Perhaps when one sees the connection with this show, perhaps they can make something new out of these. And if more people decide to adopt the new way of interpreting these symbols, maybe their hateful connections will slowly go away. Wearing these symbols one day could soon be treated much like someone who has Buddhist symbols on their shirt, or some Christian shirt. So, it's been a whole year since I recorded this video essay, and only now am I getting around to editing it. So I thought I'd give some corrections, some much needed, my opinions on it now. And, what do I regret?
I'll start with the correction by stating that there never really was such a thing as Katyogel. It turns out that Ida, I guess one of the closer things would be Odin's wife, which I find kind of funny, considering Belos is supposed to be representative in part of Odin, and Ida, who hates Belos, rightfully so, is a descendant from Odin's wife. But I also wanted to talk a bit about my opinions on reclaiming certain symbols. Now, I am aware that in the modern day they've taken on a much more controversial light, but there are honestly some symbols that I don't think we'll ever be able to reclaim, at least not within this generation or maybe even this century. The swastika, for one. I understand that it's still important for the Hindu people, the Buddhist people of the world. It's just a shame that not many people will ever be willing to learn or really know much about what they see as an always chaotic evil symbol. But when you get tied into literally adenoid Hinkle, there really is no saving it. And here's to the conclusion.
The Owl House, as demonstrated, synthesizes together various elements of Germanic paganism. While some of this likely has its roots in the painters that inspired the world of the Bordering Isles, this also has to do with several of the call-outs to Norse paganism that the Owl House makes. Both have their villainous figures that are incorrectly revered. Both have personifications of wealth and heritage that are corrupted. Both have magical systems in similar standing, and both even depict an apocalypse that saw the rebirth of the worlds. However, one major difference is in how they are accepted by certain leagues of society. Some of the symbols of Norse paganism are derided by modern society, as they have been remade into symbols of hatred towards what beasts see as inferiors, what they see as threatening their pure European ways. However, if some of the wrong people make these connections and start running with them, I can see something bad in this show's legacy in the future. I dread the thought of the Owl House becoming the Euro worship dog whistle, if that makes sense. The thing is, it's not just Norse paganism that this show incorporates. It also has a lot of other pagan cultures to it. So if you'd like to see something more, please mention them in the comment section below.